Christmas had always been a magical time in the small town of Winter Hollow. The streets sparkled with twinkling lights, the aroma of freshly baked cookies filled the air, and children ran joyfully through the snow, eagerly awaiting Santa's arrival. But there was one house no one decorated, a house the locals avoided looking at for too long: the Holloway Mansion. The town's elders told stories about that mansion. They said that many years ago, a man named Victor Holloway lived there with his family. He was a wealthy but cruel man, infamous for despising Christmas and everything it represented. Legend had it that one Christmas Eve, enraged by the carolers singing outside his house, he stormed onto the porch with a torch and shouted at them to leave. "Christmas isn't real, and Santa won't come for you," he bellowed. Later that night, the story goes, something visited him. Something dark. Something that made him and his family vanish, leaving the house in eternal silence. Since then, any attempt to inhabit the mansion ended in disaster. Christmas lights strung on its windows would mysteriously turn off, and decorated trees inside would wither within hours. Even on the quietest nights, neighbors swore they heard distorted children's laughter coming from the house, as if someone or something was mocking them. That Christmas, Emma, a young journalist searching for a story to launch her career, decided to investigate the Holloway Mansion. She had heard the rumors but didn't believe in ghost stories. "It's all exaggerated to scare tourists," she thought as she trudged through the snow, carrying her camera and a flashlight. When she arrived at the mansion, it was gloomier than she expected. The windows were coated in thick layers of dust, and the wooden door looked weathered by time. But what caught her attention was a strange detail: a pair of small footprints, like those of a child, imprinted in the snow in front of the door. There were no other signs of life around. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open, which groaned in protest. Inside, the air was icy and the scent of old wood lingered everywhere. The house was exactly as it had been left decades ago: a table adorned with rusted candelabras, a withered tree in a corner, and a grandfather clock frozen at 11:59. Emma turned on her flashlight and began snapping photos. Everything seemed calm until she noticed something unsettling in one of the pictures: a blurry figure near the tree, as if someone was standing there, watching her. She stepped back, and the floor creaked beneath her feet. At that moment, she heard a whisper, soft but distinct: "You shouldn't have come." The whisper was followed by the sound of children's laughter, as if a group of kids were running around her. But when she turned the flashlight, there was no one there. The grandfather clock started moving slowly, striking midnight, and with each chime, the room grew colder. Emma wanted to run, but something in the air kept her frozen in place. Then she saw him, a child at the base of the staircase. He wore red pajamas with a Santa hat and clutched a small teddy bear. His face was pale, and his eyes, completely black, stared directly at her. "Are you here to help us?" the child asked, his voice echoing as if coming from everywhere at once. Emma tried to speak, but no words came out. The child began ascending the stairs slowly, gesturing for her to follow. Against her will, her feet started moving. She climbed after him, feeling as though each step took her further from the outside world. On the second floor, the temperature dropped even more. The child stopped in front of a closed door and opened it without saying a word. Inside, Emma saw something she would never forget: a room filled with old toys, all covered in dust. But the most disturbing sight was at the center of the room: a table surrounded by immobile figures of children, like mannequins, their faces pale and frozen in expressions of terror. "He trapped us here," the child whispered, pointing toward a dark corner of the room. Emma directed her flashlight to where the child pointed, and there she saw it, a tall, thin figure with a twisted face, as if made of melting wax. It wore a black suit, and its long, bony fingers moved as though playing an invisible piano. As soon as its eyes met hers, her flashlight went out. In the darkness, Emma heard footsteps approaching rapidly. Her heart pounding, she ran toward the staircase, stumbling and tumbling down the last few steps. When she got up, the clock once again showed 11:59, as if time had rewound. Without looking back, she sprinted out of the house and didn't stop until she reached her car. The next day, she developed the photos she had taken, but in each one, the mansion appeared empty. There were no children, no blurry figures, no evidence of what she had experienced. However, in the final photo, taken just before she fled, something made her blood run cold. In a second-floor window, a pale face stared back at her with coal-black eyes. From that day on, Emma never celebrated Christmas again, and though she tried to forget what she had lived through, every year on Christmas Eve, she received a gift at her doorstep, a small, dust-covered toy. The Cursed Gift. In a small town surrounded by dense forests, Christmas always brought a sense of warmth and celebration. Families decorated their trees, children wrote letters to Santa Claus, and houses competed for the brightest lights. But among the many traditions of the town, there was one that no one wanted to remember: the legend of the Cursed Gift. It was said that many years ago, a wealthy family lived at the end of the main road, in a mansion now in ruins. The Montgomery family was infamous for their stinginess. They never shared their wealth nor participated in Christmas festivities. According to rumors, their fortune came from shady dealings, and their greed knew no bounds. One Christmas Eve, a mysterious man arrived in the town. He wore a long coat and a hat that concealed his face. He carried with him a box wrapped in golden paper and tied with a red ribbon. The man knocked on the Montgomery's door, and when the patriarch opened it, he offered him the gift. "It's a special present," said the stranger in a low, chilling voice. "Be sure to open it only on Christmas night." Without waiting for a reply, the man left, leaving the gift in Mr. Montgomery's hands. But instead of curiosity, the man felt distrust. He ordered his family not to touch the package. However, that night, while everyone slept, his youngest daughter, Clara, couldn't resist the temptation. Carefully, she untied the red ribbon and opened the box. Inside, she found a wooden doll, dressed as a soldier, with a smile that seemed unnaturally wide. Although the doll didn't move, Clara swore its eyes followed hers. She placed it next to the Christmas tree and went back to sleep, unaware that she had just unleashed a curse. By dawn, the Montgomery family did not wake up. The servants, upon entering the house, found them in the living room, sitting around the tree, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. At the center of the room was the doll, now with an even wider grin and hands stained with what appeared to be blood. From that day, the mansion was abandoned. The townsfolk burned the doll, but the curse was already in motion. Every Christmas, someone in the town would find a gift under their tree that they had neither bought nor wrapped. It was always something seemingly innocent: a toy, a decorative figurine, or even a simple box. It was Christmas Eve in a small town blanketed by endless snowfall. Lights twinkled in the windows of houses, and people basked in the warm glow of their fireplaces. But in an antique shop, a strange object lay in the shadows, brimming with darkness and malevolence. No one knew where it had come from or how it got there. A hand-carved nutcracker made of old wood with eyes that seemed to follow you. The antique shop belonged to Mrs. Alvarez, an elderly woman known for collecting peculiar items. However, she hadn't bought or found this nutcracker. It had simply appeared one morning in her display window, accompanied by a sign that read, "Make a wish and it will be granted. The Suarez family." Parents Julia and Gabriel and their 12-year-old daughter Clara had been struggling financially. Gabriel had lost his job, and Julia was doing her best to keep the household afloat with her part-time work. Clara was a sweet child, but lately, she seemed more worried about her parents' arguments than the holiday festivities. In a desperate attempt to lift their spirits, the family decided to visit the town square and stroll through the Christmas market. As they walked among the stalls filled with ornaments and sweets, Clara spotted the antique shop. Something drew her toward it, as though an invisible force was guiding her. When they entered, the nutcracker immediately caught her attention. "Can I have it?" Clara asked, staring at the object in fascination. Mrs. Alvarez smiled oddly and said, "It has no price. If you want it, it's yours. But remember, wishes always come at a cost." Clara's parents thought the woman was being kind and agreed to take it, unaware of what they had just unleashed. That evening, as they decorated the tree, Clara placed a nutcracker on the mantelpiece by the fire. Watching it, she recalled Mrs. Alvarez's words. With a mischievous smile, she whispered, "I wish we had a bigger tree, like the ones in the movies." The lights flickered. For a moment, the house fell into absolute silence. Then, the sound of creaking would fill the room. When they looked at the tree, it was no longer the small fir they had bought. It had transformed into a majestic pine, adorned with golden ornaments and dazzling lights. Clara's parents were stunned, but Gabriel shrugged. "Maybe someone switched it as a Christmas surprise," he said, trying to convince himself. Clara, however, knew it had been the nutcracker. That night, she dreamed of it. In her dream, the nutcracker was no longer wooden. It was a tall, thin man with a crooked smile and hollow eyes. He leaned toward her and whispered, "A wish to price." The next morning, everything seemed normal, except for one detail. The family's cat Misha had vanished. They searched the house and neighborhood but found no trace of him. Clara began to feel uneasy. Could the nutcracker have had something to do with it? That evening, during dinner, Gabriel mentioned that he had received an unexpected job offer. It was a well-paying position, just what the family needed. Clara, overjoyed, ran to the nutcracker and whispered, "Thank you." But that night, the dream returned. The thin man sat in a chair, holding an hourglass. "Gifts are never free," he said. "Everything you take must be paid for." Despite the dreams, Clara couldn't resist. The next afternoon, while her parents argued over how to spend the new income, Clara softly wished, "I wish Mom and Dad would stop fighting." Again, the lights flickered. The argument stopped abruptly, and her parents embraced as though nothing had happened. Clara felt relief, but when she glanced at the nutcracker, she could swear its smile had twisted slightly. That night, the price was paid again. Julia, her mother, began experiencing strange chest pains. They rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors found nothing physical. However, her health rapidly declined. The following days were filled with tension and fear. Clara was certain the wishes were behind everything, but she didn't know how to stop it. The nutcracker remained in its place, but it seemed more alive than ever. Its eyes gleamed, and Clara heard whispers whenever she passed by. Desperate to fix things, she decided to make one last wish. "Please, "Let Mom get better," she whispered. This time, the lights didn't flicker. Instead, a shadow slithered across the room, and the nutcracker fell to the floor. At that moment, Julia began to recover. The relief was immediate, but Clara knew something terrible was about to happen. That night, a loud crash came from the living room. Gabriel went to investigate but never returned. When Julia and Clara went to look for him, they found the nutcracker standing upright, almost human-like, holding the hourglass from Clara's dreams. "Balance must be maintained," it said in a cavernous voice. "You've taken too much." Clara tried to destroy the nutcracker, but it was impossible. Every time she struck it or threw it into the fire, it reappeared on the mantel. Finally, the family decided to get rid of it by returning it to the antique shop. However, when they arrived, the shop was empty, as if it had never existed. That Christmas, the Suarez family lost more than they gained. Although Julia and Clara managed to move on, Gabriel's disappearance left a void they could never fill. And somewhere in another town, the nutcracker reappeared in the window of another shop, waiting for its next victim. They say that if you ever come across a nutcracker with eyes that seem alive, you must run, because it always grants your wishes, but in the end, it takes something far more valuable. And you, what would you be willing to sacrifice for a wish? The Cabin of the Cursed Songs. Christmas is a perfect time for family gatherings and sharing stories by a crackling fireplace. But not all gatherings are joyful, and not all carols hide happiness. This is the story of a group of friends who decided to spend Christmas in a remote cabin, unaware that the songs they would hear there held a dark secret. A few days before Christmas, 5 friends decided to rent an old cabin in a secluded forest. Mariana, Diego, Laura, Sophia, and Julian had celebrated together for years. But this time they wanted something different, something intimate and snow-filled. The cabin, according to the internet photos, had an antique charm. Wooden walls, a large fireplace, and a gramophone that looked like it belonged to another era. "It'll be the perfect Christmas," Laura said as she booked it. They arrived on the night of December 23rd. The road was deserted, and the forest lights barely illuminated the way. When they arrived, the cabin was just as it had appeared in the photos, though there was something not mentioned in the description. A small box of vinyl records, neatly stacked next to the gramophone. Each record was labeled with strange names like Song of the Lost Steps and Carol of Shadows. Julian, a fan of vintage items, was thrilled. "This will give our Christmas a special touch," he said, unaware of what they were about to unleash. That night, after dinner and sharing stories, Julian placed the first record on the gramophone. It was called Night of Crystals. At first, the melody seemed like a traditional carol, but soon they noticed something odd. The choir's voices didn't sound human. They were whispers, as if recorded underwater. The friends laughed nervously. "What a weird thing," Mariana said, turning off the lights to create an atmosphere. However, as soon as she did, something changed. A shadow moved across the window. Diego, who was closest, approached quickly, but there was no one there. "It's just the snow," he said, trying to reassure himself. But it wasn't the snow. Julian, still by the gramophone, noticed something else. The record was spinning faster than usual, and a phrase began to repeat in the song. "Who's calling? Who's calling?" Suddenly, the melody stopped, and the gramophone emitted a high-pitched screech that shattered the silence. Despite the incident, the friends tried to enjoy the night. Christmas Eve dawned quietly, but when they stepped outside to play in the snow, they noticed something strange. There were footprints around the cabin. They weren't human or animal prints. They were deep, elongated marks, as if something with massive claws had walked around them during the night. Maybe they're from a bear, Sophia suggested, though no one seemed convinced. Mariana pointed toward the forest. Look, they end over there, but doesn't it seem odd that there are no tracks leading back? They decided not to dwell on it, though the atmosphere had already grown tense. In the afternoon, Julian found another record titled "The Voice of Those No Longer Here." Against the advice of the others, he insisted on playing it. It's Christmas, guys. What's the worst that could happen? It's just a record. He placed it on the gramophone and pressed a button. This time, it wasn't a song. It was a deep, male voice speaking in an incomprehensible language. The words sounded full of rage. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Diego ran to open it, but no one was there. On the ground, they found a box wrapped like a gift. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of them taken from outside while they were listening to the record. That night, Laura disappeared. She had gone to the bathroom and never returned. They searched the entire cabin and then the forest, but there was no trace of her. The only thing they found was her scarf, hanging on a high branch, impossible to reach without climbing. Back at the cabin, they noticed something else. The records were still stacked by the gramophone, but now there was one that hadn't been there before. It was called The Final Carol. Sophia was crying. Mariana wanted to call the police, but there was no signal. Desperate, Julian played the record. "Maybe it will give us a clue," he said. The song began as a sweet carol, but soon the lyrics changed. The voices started repeating the friends' names, one by one, as if someone were reading them aloud. When it reached Laura's name, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the forest. That night, the remaining friends decided not to sleep. The fireplace was lit, but the cold was unbearable, as if something was sucking the warmth out of the room. Mariana, staring at the gramophone, smashed it off with a single blow. But when she did, the entire cabin fell into an unnatural silence. There was no wind, no creaks, not even the sound of their own breathing. Diego was the next to disappear. The others were awake when they saw him rise, eyes closed, like a sleepwalker. He walked toward the door and into the forest without saying a word. No matter how hard they tried to stop him, they couldn't. When they realized it, the gramophone was playing again and the record was spinning on its own. The song never ended. The next day, the cabin was found empty, except for the gramophone, which continued to play that cursed carol. The friends were never seen again. They say the cabin still stands, and every Christmas someone finds those records and listens to the songs. Some say the friends are still wandering in the forest, aimlessly humming carols that no one should ever sing. Would you dare to listen to the final carol this holiday season? The twinkling lights, the fresh pine scent, and carols filled every corner of the city. However, in a small snow-covered town, there was a legend few dared to mention. It was the story of an abandoned toy factory known as the House of the Forgotten Dolls. Each Christmas, strange occurrences happened there, and those who ventured through its doors didn't always return. This is the story of a group of young friends who, defying their fears, decided to spend Christmas Eve in that place, unaware they would become part of its most terrifying secret. The toy factory had closed its doors more than 50 years ago, but still stood, covered in snow and neglect. It was said to have belonged to an artisan named Don Matias, famous for creating dolls that seemed almost alive. Obsessed with perfection, he had a strict rule. No defective toy can ever leave this place. Toys that failed to meet his standard were locked away in a special room, left to be forgotten. Over time, workers began to notice strange things, sounds in the hallways, faint giggles seemingly coming from the defective toys, and shadows moving on their own. One night, on the eve of Christmas, the factory abruptly shut down following a mysterious fire. Since then, no one dared approach, except for the curious and those who never returned. Sarah, Leo, Camila, and Marcos had been lifelong friends, lovers of challenges and scary stories. When Camila suggested spending Christmas Eve in the factory, they laughed at first, but slowly the idea gained traction. "It'll be fun," Sarah said. "Plus, we can film it and upload it to social media." Marcos, always looking to impress Camila, offered to bring his camera. On the night of December 24th, armed with flashlights and a backpack full of snacks and drinks, they arrived at the factory. Snow crunched under their boots as they approached the rusty gate. With a loud creak, it swung open. "Welcome to the House of the Forgotten Dolls," Leo joked, trying to lighten the mood. Inside, the factory was dusty and covered in cobwebs. Shelves lay toppled. Toy parts were scattered on the floor, and an eerie feeling of being watched lingered. In one corner, they found an old Christmas tree decorated not with baubles, but with rag dolls. Each doll had a unique expression, some smiling, some sad, and most disturbingly lifelike. "This gives me the creeps," Sarah murmured, but Marcos ignored her and began filming. Camila found an old ledger on a table. Opening it, they discovered it was an inventory of defective toys. "Porcelain doll with crooked eyes," Camila read aloud. "Tin soldier with a broken arm." At the bottom of the list was a note. "Never open the room of the forgotten. Keep it locked for safety." Naturally, this piqued their interest. Driven by curiosity and a lack of common sense, the friends searched for the room mentioned in the ledger. They found it at the end of a long hallway. The door was secured with chains and a massive padlock, but someone had conveniently left a crowbar nearby, almost as if inviting them to try. "This is a bad idea," Sarah warned, but the others were determined. Leo used the crowbar to break the lock, and the door creaked open. Inside, they found hundreds of dolls piled on shelves and in boxes. They were unlike any toys they'd ever seen. Porcelain dolls with wide, unblinking eyes, clowns with twisted smiles, puppets tangled in their own strings, and teddy bears with unsettling stares. Suddenly, there was a loud bang behind them. The door slammed shut. "Relax, it's just a wind," Marco said, though his voice wavered. As they searched for a way out, Camila noticed something chilling. The dolls weren't in the same positions. One that had been sitting was now facing them. Another, a clown with a crooked grin, seemed to have moved closer. "They're moving," Sarah whispered. No one wanted to believe it, but then they heard it. A high-pitched giggle, like that of a child. Their flashlight beams began to flicker, and one of the dolls fell to the floor with a loud crash. "Let's get out of here," Leo shouted, but when they tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The cold crept into the room, and the giggles turned into whispers. The dolls were awake. Camila screamed first, feeling something brush against her leg. It was a teddy bear with metallic claws emerging from its paws. Marcos tried to pull it off, but a tin soldier climbed up his back, stabbing him with a rusty bayonet. The dolls began to surround them, moving erratically but quickly. A clown with black eyes lunged at Sarah, while puppets tangled Leo in their strings. Every attempt to fight them off only brought more toys out of the shadows. Amid the chaos, Camila remembered something from the ledger. The defectives only seek perfection, "That's it," she shouted. "They want us to fix what's broken. But how?" While the others fought for their lives, Camila found an old toolbox in a corner. With trembling hands, she started repairing the toys, reattaching arms, gluing eyes, and sewing smiles. To her astonishment, the repaired dolls went still, as if finding peace. "Help me," she cried. The others joined in, though every action was a desperate struggle for survival. One by one, the toys fell silent, until only the largest clown, seemingly the leader, remained. With a final effort, Sarah sewed its torn smile, and the doll collapsed. As the last stitch was made, the door burst open. Injured and terrified, the friends fled into the snowy forest. They never returned to the factory, but as they ran, they swore they heard a faint whisper. "Thank you for restoring our perfection." That Christmas, the four made a pact of silence. But every year in December, small dolls appear outside their homes. None of them has the courage to check if they're broken. Would you dare visit the house of the forgotten dolls? Snow fell gently over the small town of Hollow Pines, covering everything with a white blanket that glistened under the lights of homes adorned for Christmas. It was the eve of the grand holiday, and the air was filled with joy and anticipation. But in an old, decrepit mansion on the edge of the woods, a dark secret lay waiting to change everything. That morning, the Thompsons, a family consisting of parents Laura and Peter and their children Sophie and Jack, found a package on their doorstep. The box was wrapped in bright red gift paper, tied with a perfectly placed golden ribbon. It bore no sender, only a tag that read, "For the Thompsons. Open on Christmas Eve." Curious, they brought the package inside. It was odd, but they assumed a neighbor might have left it as a surprise. However, when 8-year-old Sophie pressed her ear to the package, she swore she heard a faint murmur, as if something or someone was inside. "It must be a toy," Peter said with a laugh, trying to dispel the unease that was beginning to creep into the air. They decided to place the package under the tree and open it after dinner, as the tag instructed. What they didn't realize was that this simple act would mark the beginning of their nightmare. That evening, as the family dined, the lights on the Christmas tree began to flicker, first sporadically, then going out entirely. Peter went to check them, and as he touched the bulbs, he felt an intense cold, almost like frostbite. "Probably an electrical fault," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. But when the lights came back on, Sophie screamed. One of the ornaments, a small golden star that had been at the top of the tree, was now on the floor, split in two. "No one touched it," Jack said, glancing around. The unease grew, but they tried to ignore it. After all, it was Christmas. After dinner, it was time to open presents. The children eagerly tore into theirs, leaving the mysterious package for last. When Laura picked it up to place it on the table, the box shifted slightly in her hands, as if something inside was struggling to get out. "Did you see that?" Sophie asked, her eyes wide. Laura denied it, but her expression gave her away. The package was heavier than she expected, and something thudded softly from within. Despite their hesitation, Peter opened the box. Inside, they found a hand-carved wooden doll, dressed in a red suit and a Christmas hat. It had shiny black eyes and a crooked smile that evoked no warmth. In its right hand, it held a small hammer. "It's interesting," Peter remarked, attempting to mask his discomfort. Sophie wanted to hold it, but something in the doll's gaze made Laura tell her not to touch it. That night, as everyone slept, Laura was awakened by a strange sound. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. She assumed one of the children was up, but when she checked, both Sophie and Jack were sound asleep in their beds. Descending to the living room, her heart nearly stopped. The doll was no longer in its box. It was now sitting on the couch, its head tilted to one side, as if it were watching her. Laura stepped back, but as she did, her foot landed on something. It was the hammer the doll had been holding. Before she could react, she heard a whisper, a deep, cold voice saying, "Thank you for freeing me." The Christmas tree lights began to flicker again, and one by one, the ornaments fell to the floor. Laura ran back to her room, locking the door behind her. It was just a dream, she repeated to herself over and over, but sleep never came. The next morning, the family awoke to find the living room in complete disarray. Ornaments were scattered, furniture was scratched, and the Christmas tree had withered overnight. "What happened here?" Peter asked, trying to calm the frightened children. That's when Sophie pointed to the wall. Written in something dark, perhaps ash, were the words, one by one. "This can't be happening," Laura muttered. They decided to get rid of the doll, but when they searched the box, they found only the golden ribbon. The doll had vanished. That afternoon, Jack began acting strangely. He sat in silence for hours, staring at a corner of the room. When Laura shook him to snap him out of it, he turned to her with vacant eyes and spoke in a voice that wasn't his own. "He's coming for you." That night, the doll returned. It appeared at the front door, dragging its hammer along the ground. But it was no longer a mere wooden toy. It had grown to the size of a child, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent light. Peter tried to attack it with a bat, but the doll was unervingly fast. It dodged the blow with ease and knocked Peter down with a surprising force. "This house is mine now," it declared, its laughter chilling to the bone. The family fled to the basement, seeking refuge, but the doll pursued them. In their desperation, Sophie remembered something she had read in an old book. Malignant spirits like this could be trapped if their object of origin was burned. "The box!" she shouted. Laura and Peter raced back to the living room, dodging the doll's attacks, and found the box. They threw it into the fire, while Sophie and Jack prayed it would work. The doll let out an inhuman scream that shook the house. Its body began to crumble, turning to ashes that were swept away by the wind. The family survived, but Christmas was never the same for them. They sold the house and moved far away. But every year during the holidays, they received a package with no sender. None of them dared to open it. If you ever find an anonymous gift at your door, remember this story. Sometimes, gifts are not what they seem. It was Christmas Eve in the small, secluded town of Black Hollow, nestled between snow-capped mountains and shrouded in an aura of mystery. Despite its picturesque beauty, the air carried a sense of unease that grew heavier with each passing year as Christmas approached. The Parker family, new to the ancient house on the edge of town, was unaware of the town's dark legends. Thomas and Emily, along with their children Olivia and Ben, sought peace and quiet away from the city for the holidays. The house, though spacious and adorned with a grand fireplace, held a gloom that seemed to seep into its very walls. They had heard murmurs about the mansion's past, but dismissed them as local folklore. One frosty afternoon, as the children played in the snow-covered yard, Emily ventured into the attic. There, she stumbled upon a dusty box wrapped in tattered gift paper and tied with a frayed red ribbon. Inside, she found an old music book with a worn black leather cover. The title, "The Forbidden Carol," was etched in faded golden letters, vanishing at her touch. Intrigued, Emily carried it downstairs and placed it on the living room table, thinking little of it. That evening, during dinner, Olivia, the 10-year-old, began to hum an unfamiliar tune. "It's a strange song," she said, surprising everyone. The melody had an eerie quality, as though another voice accompanied hers, faint and unsettling. Concerned, Emily asked where she had learned the song. Olivia innocently replied, "I found it in the book." Alarmed, Emily and Thomas retrieved the book. As they opened it, the sheet music glimmered faintly, as if illuminated by a hidden light. The melody, written in archaic notation, was indecipherable, yet its haunting essence lingered in their minds. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to play it, assuming it was a forgotten carol. But as the first notes filled the room, the Christmas tree lights began to flicker erratically. Suddenly, a chilling wind swept through the house, and the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe. A deep, guttural sound echoed from the depths of the house, as though something ancient stirred. Terrified, Emily slammed the book shut, and the house seemed to exhale. The walls creaked, and a faint whisper filled the air. "You should never have sung the song. That night turned into a nightmare." Olivia spoke in an unfamiliar tongue in her sleep, while Ben wept uncontrollably, pointing at the window where a dark figure appeared to watch from the snowstorm. When they investigated, the figure was gone, but the oppressive sensation of being observed remained. The next morning brought an eerie calm, though a heavy tension gripped the house. Determined to understand what was happening, Thomas visited the town library. The elderly librarian grew pale at the sight of the music book and began trembling. That is the song that calls the sleeper," he whispered. "An ancient curse." The librarian explained that the carol was a creation of a long-forgotten cult in Black Hollow. According to legend, it was composed to summon an entity known as the Keeper of the Night, a malevolent force that fed on the souls of those who dared to sing it. The Keeper was trapped in another dimension, and the carol served as the key to its prison. "It is a rule in this town," the librarian continued, "that no one sings that song. Those who did were never seen again." Thomas felt a chill run through him and raced back to the house, but it was too late. Olivia was gone. That night, the Parkers locked themselves in their home, but the shadows outside the windows grew long and strange. Unseen whispers filled the air, and in the heart of the night, a figure approached, the entity awakened by the song. In the living room where the carol had first been played, the atmosphere was heavy with an unnatural energy. The figure stood in the doorway, its form obscured in darkness, with glowing red eyes like twin moons. It carried an ancient book similar to the one Emily had discovered. The creature began to sing the song, its voice deep and icy, like the wind through barren trees. As it sang, the house began to collapse. Cracks snaked across the walls, and the snow outside the windows ignited in an otherworldly, frozen flame. The Parkers tried to flee, but the entity surrounded them, its presence suffocating. In their minds, the melody of the carol transformed into a mocking, piercing laughter. In a desperate bid to save her family, Emily grabbed the book and hurled it into the fire. But the creature only laughed, a sound that reverberated through the town as though Christmas itself was weeping. "It's too late," it said as darkness engulfed the house. The Parker family vanished that night, and though Black Hollow still celebrates Christmas, a warning lingers in the air: never sing the forbidden carol. Every Christmas, when the lights of the town's trees begin to flicker, it's said that someone hears a faint melody in the distance, too soft, too strange to be human. The icy wind howled fiercely that night in the village of Evergreen Ridge, a remote place covered by a thick layer of snow that never seemed to melt. It was Christmas Eve, but in Evergreen Ridge, there were no celebrations. The few inhabitants of the village stayed inside their homes, avoiding the dark secrets hidden within the festive season's shadows. The Matthews family had decided to move to Evergreen Ridge for a fresh start. Emily and her husband Daniel, along with their children Charlotte and Samuel, arrived at an old farmhouse on the outskirts of the village. The house was an ancient mansion with thick walls and windows that creaked with every gust of wind. But Emily was convinced the move would be the best for them all. After all, they had purchased a house at a low price, and though it had a worn appearance, its walls retained a nostalgic beauty. The family arrived just in time for the Christmas festivities. Emily decorated the tree. Charlotte, the 11-year-old daughter, helped hang the lights, while Samuel, her 8-year-old brother, ran through the house playing with their dog. It was a typical Christmas afternoon, but something in the air felt tense, as if the house itself breathed an atmosphere unlike anywhere else. That night, as they all sat at the dinner table, strange whispers began to emanate from the walls. These were not the usual creaks of an old house, but unmistakable voices, whispers speaking in an ancient, unknown language. Daniel, ever the skeptic, tried to downplay it, but Emily couldn't shake her discomfort. "It's just the old pipes," he said, seeking a logical explanation, but Emily remained unconvinced. That night, after the family went to bed, the whispers grew louder. Samuel woke up with a start, staring into the dark hallway. "Mom," he whispered, "there's someone in the house." Emily held him close, trying to calm him, but when the family woke up the next morning, they discovered something terrifying. In the living room beside the Christmas tree, there was a strange package. It was wrapped in shiny red paper with a golden ribbon, identical to the ones Emily had used to decorate the tree. However, what was odd wasn't the gift itself, but the tag that read, "To the Matthews. Open on Christmas Eve." Emily and Daniel exchanged puzzled looks. No one had entered their home. Moreover, there were no footprints in the snow outside, making the gift's appearance even more unsettling. "We should ignore it," Daniel suggested. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the present was somehow connected to the strange whispers from the previous night. Despite their reservations, the family decided to wait until Christmas Eve to open the package. The atmosphere in the house that day was strange and tense. When the time came, Emily and Daniel, filled with trepidation, placed the gift in the center of the table. Charlotte and Samuel, curious and excited, leaned in as their parents untied the ribbon. What they found inside left them frozen with fear. It wasn't a toy or a Christmas ornament as they had expected. Instead, it was a carved wooden figure, a doll with an antiquated appearance and a face eerily sculpted into a crooked smile. It wore a green and red outfit with golden details, but its pale and lifeless face stood out the most, with eyes dark and empty, as if all color had been drained from them. "What is this?" Charlotte asked, touching the doll nervously. Samuel, however, backed away quickly, feeling an icy chill run through him. Emily stared at the doll, and at that moment, the whispering voices returned, closer and louder this time. "I saw it in the book," Charlotte exclaimed, running to the shelf where they had placed some old books about the village's history. The book, which Emily had found during the move, contained strange tales of local legends. Charlotte had read about a figure called the Spirit of Lost Christmases, a being that, according to the stories, took the form of carved dolls and was linked to those who had become lost in time, trapped in an eternal Christmas vigil. Before Emily could ask more, The house's atmosphere began to shift. The lights on the tree flickered out, and the air grew heavy. Samuel, trembling, murmured, "It's here. The doll is alive." A loud bang echoed from the hallway. Emily and Daniel rushed toward the noise, but what they saw paralyzed them. The doll stood upright, staring directly at them as if it were aware of their presence. "Don't touch it," Emily shouted, but it was too late. Samuel, driven by an inexplicable curiosity, picked up the doll from the table. At that moment, the Christmas tree lights began to flash violently, and a sinister laughter filled the air. The whispering voices grew louder and clearer, as though they were now inside their heads. "Why have you awakened us?" The doll's figure dissolved into a cloud of shadows that surrounded the family. Whenever they tried to move or scream, the whispers grew more intense and piercing. Emily felt an increasing pressure on her chest, as though being watched by countless invisible eyes. Suddenly, the floor began to creak, and a crack appeared in the center of the room, opening into the unknown. From the depths of the dark fissure, a hand emerged, long, thin fingers reaching toward Emily and her family. "Run!" Daniel yelled. The family fled to the basement, where they found a door they had never seen before. Upon opening it, they discovered a room filled with old Christmas decorations, all of which seemed to be watching them with empty eyes. Terrified, Emily spotted an old journal in a corner. In its pages, she read a final warning. "The House of Whispers will claim us forever unless the doll is released. Free it, or we will become part of the cycle." The Matthews family was never seen again. The house, however, remained empty, covered in a layer of snow that never melted. And every Christmas, in the deserted streets of Evergreen Ridge, whispers can be heard emanating from the House of Christmas Whispers. If you ever decide to visit that village, remember, never touch a doll that appears at your door on Christmas Eve. It was a cold and windy night in the small town of Black Hollow. Christmas lights adorned the houses, creating a strange contrast with the thick fog that slid through the deserted streets. The townspeople, who once celebrated the holiday with enthusiasm, now avoided any mention of Christmas. After all, every winter brought with it a shadow that, though invisible, grew heavier with each passing year. The town had been founded in the 18th century, but the legends surrounding it were far older. At the center of Black Hollow stood a dilapidated church, its tower rising lonely and almost forgotten amid the more modern buildings surrounding the square. It was there that everything had begun. The story of Black Hollow and its connection to Christmas had been passed down in whispers among the town's elders, but was rarely spoken of aloud. It was said that each Christmas, on Christmas Eve, something dark would awaken, something that had been forgotten for generations. And with its awakening, people began to vanish without a trace. The Adams family moved to Black Hollow unaware of the town's dark history. Daniel, the father, had secured a good job at the local library and his wife, and decided to move with him and their 2 children, Emma and Luke, hoping the quiet town would be a perfect place to raise their kids. Christmas was approaching, and the cold air already enveloped their new house, located near the church. Unaware that this proximity would place them at the center of the darkness lurking in Black Hollow, Christmas Eve arrived, and the family was excited to begin their traditions. Anna had decorated the tree, hung the stockings, and prepared a special dinner. The warmth of the fire and the hearth filled the house with a cozy atmosphere, but there was something unsettling in the air, something inexplicable, a strange feeling, as though someone was watching them from the shadows. That night, as the family dined, the house lights began to flicker. "You must have bumped the switch," Daniel said. trying to downplay the incident, but Anne, more attuned to the atmosphere, felt a chill run down her spine. Suddenly, a dull knock at the front door disrupted the calm of the night, and went to open it, but no one was there. Only the wind, howling fiercely, pushing snow across the threshold. But next to the door was an old wooden box covered in dust. It had no sender or message, only a strange inscription carved into its surface. For those who lived near the church, intrigued, Daniel and Anne brought the box into the living room, where Emma and Luke waited eagerly to open it. When they lifted the lid, a strange cold air filled the room. Inside was a small hand-carved wooden doll with a crooked smile etched onto its face. Its eyes, made of tiny black crystals, reflected a sinister light. "It's strange," and said, unable to take her eyes off it. Something about the doll seemed alive. The family decided to leave it on the table and continue their celebration, but that night, as everyone slept, the noises began. At first, soft whispers seeped through the cracks in the windows. Then, dragging footsteps on the wooden floor, growing closer and closer, and woke up startled. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she heard what sounded like soft laughter, a child's laughter, coming from the living room. When she got up, the door to the children's room slammed shut. Stepping into the hallway, she saw the shadow of a small figure dart quickly toward the living room. The wooden doll was no longer on the table. A shiver ran down her spine when she saw the doll standing in the doorway of the living room. It was upright, staring at her, its crooked smile wider than before, and couldn't scream. The doll began to move, dragging its wooden feet across the floor, slowly approaching her. "Why are you looking at me?" and whispered shakily, but the doll didn't respond. It just kept advancing, desperate, and ran to the church, seeking refuge. She entered the dark building, where the cold air enveloped her. Inside, she found something even more unsettling. On the altar, there was a row of wooden dolls, all with similar smiles and eyes that reflected a macabre light. Each was placed in a line, and at the back, an inscription on the wall read, "To the forgotten, to those no longer remembered, we grant life in the darkness." It was then she understood. The dolls weren't just wooden figures. They were trapped souls, the souls of those who had vanished from Black Hollow on Christmas Eve for generations. They were the forgotten victims, used as vessels for cursed spirits. As Anne tried to escape, she saw shadows moving around the church. The wooden figures began to rise slowly, walking toward her, their eyes glowing red and their laughter echoing through the space. In that moment, she realized she would never escape. Black Hollow had a sinister tradition, and Christmas was only the beginning of the nightmare. By dawn, the Addams family was gone. No one in the town ever saw them again. The house remained empty, but every Christmas, the fog would return to Black Hollow, and lights would shine in the vacant windows. Sometimes, villagers swore they saw small wooden figures in the shadows, slowly moving toward the church. If you ever decide to visit Black Hollow, remember this tale, because in that town, Christmas is not a time of joy. It is a time for the forgotten, and the forgotten never stop coming back.